It was the late 1870s. The Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe was digging at Birka, a major Viking Age trading town. He uncovered a remarkable chamber grave. It was labeled BJ 581. Inside lay a skeleton surrounded by a stunning array of weapons. There was a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 shields. A battle knife was also present. The person was buried with 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, and on their lap sat a set of gaming pieces. For over 100 years, everyone assumed this was the grave of a high-ranking male warrior. The sheer quality and quantity of the military equipment made any other conclusion seem impossible. The skeleton's features were considered slender, but this was explained away. He was just not a physically large man. The grave became a textbook example of a Viking chieftain. Then in the 2010s, something shifted. Researchers began to question old assumptions. Osteologist Anna Källström at Stockholm University noticed the skeleton's pelvic bone and cheekbones seemed more typically female. She suggested a closer look. This idea was met with skepticism. The warrior was too important, too iconic to be a woman. But the questions persisted. Finally, a team led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson decided to settle it. They extracted DNA from a tooth and an arm bone. The results came back in 2017. There was no Y chromosome. The DNA was XX, the great Viking warrior of Birka, buried with a full arsenal and gaming pieces that suggested a mind for strategy, was a woman. The evidence was right there in her genes. It was the most direct, unambiguous proof that stories of shield maidens were not just fantasy. They were based on real women who lived, fought, and were buried as honored warriors. Number 20, the word itself was a clue. The Old Norse language had a word for them, skjaldmær. It translates directly to shieldmaiden. The very existence of this term is a powerful piece of evidence. Languages develop words for things that exist, for concepts people need to discuss. You do not invent a specific compound noun for something that is purely imaginary, especially not in a society as pragmatic as that of the Norse. They had words for farmers, blacksmiths, sailors, and kings because those people were part of their world. They also had a word for a female warrior. Let's think about the components. Skjald means shield. This was the primary defensive tool of a Viking warrior. It was not just a passive piece of wood and leather. It was used actively to block, to bash, to create an opening. The shield wall, or skjaldborg, was the core tactical formation of a Viking army. To be associated with the shield was to be associated with the very heart of their warfare. Mare means maiden or girl. So a shield maiden was a woman defined by her shield, by her role in combat. The term appears in several key texts. One of the most famous is the Hervarar saga Oke Hydrex. In this saga, the hero Hervar is explicitly called a shield maiden. She takes on a man's name, wears men's clothing, and leads a band of Vikings. She is not a woman who happens to fight. She is a warrior, and her identity is that of a shield maiden. The saga treats this as unusual, but not impossible. It has a category, a word, for what she is. Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing in the 12th century, also uses terms that describe women fighting with shields. In his account of the legendary Battle of Bravalla, he lists 3 female captains by name Webiorg, Wisna, and Heitha, who led contingents of warriors. He describes them as skilled fighters, women who preferred battle to domestic life. The presence of the word skjaldmær across different sources, from Iceland to Denmark, suggests a shared cultural concept. Even if shield maidens were rare, they were not unthinkable. The language had a place for them. This is different from a vague description. It is a specific label. It implies a recognized role, however uncommon. Laws are often made to forbid things that people are actually doing. Similarly, words are often coined to describe things people are actually seeing or experiencing. The word skjaldmær did not spring from nowhere. It grew out of a world where the idea of a woman holding a shield and standing in a battle line was real enough to need a name. Number 19, the laws that tried to stop them. Sometimes the strongest evidence for a certain behavior is the law written to forbid it. People do not waste time creating rules against things that never happen. There is no ancient law against flying to the moon on a goose because nobody was doing it. But there were laws in Viking Age Scandinavia that specifically addressed women and weapons. This suggests that some women were in fact picking up weapons. One of the most telling examples comes from the Old Norwegian law codes, particularly the Gulathing law. This was a body of law that governed Western Norway, established sometime around 900 AD. One section of the law deals with what happens if a woman dresses in men's clothes, cuts her hair short, and carries weapons. This act was grounds for divorce and could lead to the woman being declared an outlaw. Why would such a law exist? It implies that this was a known phenomenon. It was something that society had to react to and regulate. The law is not about a woman defending her home from a raid with a kitchen knife. It is about a woman adopting the full persona of a warrior, the clothes, the haircut, the weapons. This was a transgression of established gender roles, and the legal system sought to punish it. The very need for the punishment is proof of the crime. Another piece of legal evidence comes from the Icelandic law code, the Gragas. While it does not explicitly forbid women from being warriors, it lays out a social order where roles are clearly defined. But it also contains fascinating details. For instance, in rules about feuds and vengeance, it was the male relatives who were legally obligated to seek revenge for a slain kinsman. A woman could incite the men to vengeance, a powerful role known as vatning, but she was not expected to carry it out herself. However, the sagas, which often reflect the social tensions the laws tried to resolve, are full of women who blur these lines. They mock men for not being brave enough, and sometimes take matters into their own hands. The existence of strict gender roles in law does not mean everyone followed them. In fact, it often means the opposite. The lines were being crossed, and the authorities were trying to draw them more firmly. So when we see a law from the 10th century that says a woman can be outlawed for carrying weapons, our first question should not be, did they follow this law? It should be, who were the women who made this law necessary? They were the real-life shieldmaidens, the women who defied convention to such a degree that the legal system had to create a specific rule to try and stop them. The law itself is a ghost of their actions, a footprint left in the legal code. On number 18, the Byzantine historian who saw them with his own eyes. In the year 971 AD, the Byzantine Empire was at war. The Emperor John I Tzimiskis was leading his army against Sviatoslav I of Kiev. Sviatoslav's army was made up of Rus's warriors. These were Vikings, mostly from Sweden, who had traveled east and established a powerful state based in Kiev. The final bloody battle of this war was the Siege of Doraston on the Danube River. After a brutal fight, the Ruses were defeated. The Byzantines were methodical record keepers. A historian named John Skylitzis was there to chronicle the campaign. As the Byzantines stripped the armor from the fallen Ruses' warriors after the battle, they made a shocking discovery. Skylitzis wrote about it in his history, the synopsis of histories. He stated that among the armed dead, they found the bodies of women. They were dressed in the same armor as the men, and had fought and died alongside them. This is not a legend or a saga written down 200 years after the fact. This is a contemporary account from a sober-minded historian from a completely different culture. Skylitzis had no reason to invent this detail. The Byzantines were not known for romanticizing their enemies. To him, this was a strange and noteworthy fact about these fierce northern barbarians. He recorded it as he saw it. His account is incredibly specific. He does not say, I heard stories of women fighters. He says they were found among the dead on the battlefield. This implies they were part of the Rus' army, not just camp followers who picked up a spear in a desperate final stand. They were equipped for war. They fell in combat. The location is also significant. The Ruses of Kiev were deeply connected to their Scandinavian homeland. The men and women fighting at Doraston were only a few generations removed from those who had first crossed the Baltic. They carried Viking culture, traditions, and social structures with them. If women were fighting in the Rus's army in 971, it is highly probable that women were also fighting in the armies back in Scandinavia. Skylitz's account is one of the most powerful pieces of external evidence we have. It is an outsider's observation, free from the cultural baggage of the Norse sagas. He was not trying to tell a heroic story, he was just reporting the facts of a military campaign, and one of those facts was that when the Russes went to war, their women sometimes went with them, armed and ready to fight. It is a brief, stark, and utterly convincing clue. Number 17, a woman buried with a battle axe in Denmark. In 2012, archaeologists were excavating a Viking Age burial site in Herup, Denmark. They uncovered a double grave. Inside were the skeletons of a man and a woman laid to rest together around the year 950 AD. This was not unusual, but the grave goods were. The man was buried with his weapons as a high-status warrior would be, but so was the woman. Lying across her body was a large iron battle axe. The axe was not a small decorative item. It was a full-sized, functional weapon of war. It was the classic Danish axe, a formidable weapon known for its ability to split shields and helmets. Its placement in the grave directly associated with the woman was intentional. It was meant to be her possession in the afterlife. The man in the grave had his own sword, marking him as a warrior. The axe marked her as one too. Ella Al-Shamahi, a paleoanthropologist who studied the site, noted that this was not a simple case of a weapon being added as a family heirloom. The context of the burial suggested the man and woman were a couple, perhaps a ruling pair. The presence of two sets of weapons implies that they shared a warrior status. They were a power couple in the most literal sense. The Herup grave is important because it is clear and unambiguous. Unlike some graves where a single weapon might be interpreted in different ways, this one presents us with two individuals, one male and one female, both equipped for battle. It challenges the simple idea that weapons in graves always belong to men. Furthermore, this discovery is part of a growing pattern. As archaeologists re-examine old finds and make new ones, more and more graves of women containing weapons are coming to light. A grave in Solor, Norway from the 10th century held a woman buried with a sword, a spear, and an axe. Another in England from the same period contained a female skeleton with a sword and shield. Each discovery on its own might be dismissed as an anomaly, but together they form a compelling body of evidence. The woman of Herup was not a one-off. She was part of a tradition where a woman's power and role could include the bearing of arms. The axe buried with her was a statement. It said that her identity, her status, and her path to the afterlife were tied to the life of a warrior. She was not just a chieftain's wife. She may well have been a chieftain herself. Number 16, the Viking Queen of the Oseberg ship. In 1904, a spectacular discovery was made on a farm in Oseberg, Norway. A massive burial mound was opened to reveal an almost perfectly preserved Viking ship. It was 70 feet long, ornately carved, and filled with an incredible treasure trove of goods. This was clearly a burial for someone of immense importance. Inside the ship's burial chamber, archaeologists found the remains of two women. The Oseberg ship burial, dated to around 834 AD, has long puzzled historians. Who were these two women who warranted such an extravagant funeral? One was older, perhaps in her 70s or 80s, and suffered from severe arthritis. The other was younger, around 50 years old. DNA analysis suggested they might be related. For years, the prevailing theory was that the older woman was a queen or a high priestess, and the younger woman was her sacrificed servant. But the grave goods tell a more complex story. There were no weapons of war like swords or axes. This has been used as an argument against them being shieldmaidens in the traditional sense. However, the items buried with them speak of immense power and authority. There were 4 sleighs, a horse-drawn cart, beds, chests, tapestries, and a huge variety of tools for weaving and cooking. These were the tools of a powerful household, the command center of a large estate. More recently, scholars have begun to re-evaluate the Oseberg burial. The idea of the younger woman being a mere servant has been challenged. Her remains were treated with as much respect as the older woman's. Perhaps they were co-rulers, or a queen and her chosen successor. The power they wielded was not necessarily on the battlefield, but it was power nonetheless. And this is a crucial clue. Viking society was not just about raiding, it was about land, wealth, and political control. The women of Oseberg were at the absolute pinnacle of that society. They had the authority to command men, to control resources, and to receive a burial that rivaled any king's. This level of female authority is the necessary social foundation for the existence of shieldmaidens. If a woman could be a queen, a priestess, or a major landowner, is it so far-fetched to believe she could also be a military leader? The Oseberg women show us the ceiling for female power in the Viking Age was very high. While they may not have been shield maidens themselves, they created and lived in a world where powerful women were a reality. They proved that a woman's role was not limited to the home. It could extend to the throne, and from there, it is only a short step to the battlefield. Number 15, The Tale of Hervor and the Cursed Sword. The sagas are the great literature of the Viking Age, written down mostly in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries. They tell stories of heroes, feuds, and voyages. While they are not literal history, they are a window into the Norse mindset. And in these sagas, we find some of the most detailed portraits of shield maidens. One of the most striking is the story of Hervor from Hervorar Saga Oke Heidreks. Hervor was the daughter of a famous Viking named Angantyr. Angantyr was killed in a duel and buried in a mound on an island with his magic cursed sword Turfing. Hervor grew up never knowing her father, but she was not like other girls. She learned archery, swordplay, and horsemanship. As a young woman, she put on men's clothing, took the name Hervard, and became the leader of a band of Vikings, earning a reputation as a fierce raider. But she was not content. She wanted the sword that was her birthright. She sailed to the island where her father was buried. The island was said to be haunted, and her crew was terrified to land. Hervor went ashore alone at night. She approached the burial mound, which was wreathed in ghostly flames. She called out to her father's spirit, demanding the sword Turfing. The voice of Angantyr answered from the grave. He warned her that the sword was cursed and would bring ruin to her and her descendants. He urged her to leave it be and live a normal life. Hervor refused. She mocked his fear and insisted she was worthy of the sword. She declared, "You are no more my father than you are a king, if you deny me the sword." Finally, impressed by her courage, the grave opened. A spectral hand offered her the glowing sword. She took it and returned to her ship. The story of Hervor is powerful. She is not a woman forced into fighting by circumstance. She chooses the warrior's life. She actively rejects traditional female roles and carves out her own identity. She is intelligent, brave, and utterly determined. The saga presents her as a hero, a worthy heir to a legendary weapon. Of course, this is a mythological story, but the myths a culture tells reveal its values and possibilities. The fact that the Icelanders told and retold the story of Hervor means that the concept of a woman like her was part of their cultural imagination. She was a role model, an archetype. The story provided a blueprint for how a woman could step into a man's world and succeed on her own terms. It is a literary clue, but a profound one, suggesting that the line between a woman's world and a warrior's world was not as solid as we might think. Number 14, Freydis Eriksdottir, the Terror of Vinland. Not all shield maidens are found in mythology. Some appear in the historical sagas, which chronicle the settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and the brief Norse presence in North America. One of the most formidable and historically plausible female warriors is Freydis Eriksdottir. She was the daughter of the famous Eric the Red and the sister of Leif Erikson, the first European to set foot in North America. Her story is told in the Saga of the Greenlanders. Around the year 1004, Freydis joined an expedition to Vinland, the land Leif had discovered. She was a partner in the venture, not just a passenger. The expedition was a joint one with two Icelandic brothers, and tensions quickly grew between the two groups. Freydis, described as a domineering and ambitious woman, deliberately stoked the conflict. She eventually manipulated her husband into believing the brothers had insulted her, goading him and her men into attacking the Icelanders' camp while they slept. After her men had killed all the men in the Icelandic party, they hesitated before the 5 women who were with them. No one would harm them. Freydis was furious. She seized an axe and, according to the saga, killed the 5 women herself. It was a brutal, ruthless act, but her most famous moment came earlier. During their time in Vinland, the Norse settlement was attacked by the native inhabitants, whom the sagas call Skraelings. The Norsemen, despite their weapons, were panicked by the sheer number of attackers and their strange war cries. They began to flee. Freydis, who was pregnant at the time, saw the retreat. She shouted at them, "Why do you run from such worthless wretches, stout men that you are, when you could likely slaughter them like cattle? Let me have a weapon. I think I could fight better than any of you." The men did not listen. As she tried to keep up, she came across the body of a fallen Norseman with his sword beside him. She picked it up. As the Skraelings closed in, she pulled one of her breasts from her tunic and slapped it with the flat of the sword blade. The saga says that the sight of this fierce, pregnant woman screaming a war cry and beating her chest with a sword so terrified the natives that they turned and fled. Freydis is not a romantic hero. She is a complex, violent, and ambitious figure. But her story, recorded in a saga that is considered to have a strong historical core, is a vital clue. It shows a real woman in a real historical setting, taking up a weapon and turning the tide of a battle through sheer ferocity. It also shows a woman in a position of leadership capable of both inspiring and committing terrible violence. You know, she was no fantasy. She was a Viking woman, and in her we see the Shieldmaiden made of flesh and blood. Number 13. The Shieldmaiden captains at the Battle of Bravalla. Saxo Grammaticus was a Danish historian who, around 1200 AD, wrote a massive work called Gesta Danorum, or Deeds of the Danes. It is a history of Denmark from its mythical origins up to his own time. Much of the early part is based on legends, poems, and oral traditions. While not strictly factual, it provides invaluable insight into the stories the Vikings told about themselves. And in his description of the legendary Battle of Bravalla, Saxo gives us one of the most vivid accounts of Shieldmaidens in action. The battle, supposed to have taken place in the 8th century, was a colossal conflict between Sigurd Hring, king of the Swedes and West Geats, and his uncle Harald Wartooth, king of the Danes and East Geats. Both sides mustered huge armies drawn from all over the Viking world. On the Danish side, fighting for Harald Wartooth, Saxo lists several notable warriors. Among them, he names 3 women who served as captains. He gives their names Webiorg, Wisna, and Hitha. He does not just mention them in passing, he describes their role. He says that Webiorg was a skilled fighter who commanded a contingent of Slavs. Wisna, a woman with a man's heart, was a fierce standard bearer. Hetha was the chieftain of an entire territory and brought her own army to the battle. Saxo goes on to give a general description of these women. He writes that there were women from Harald's kingdom who dressed as men and devoted their lives to warfare. He says they were eager for battle and trained their bodies to be strong and tough. They were, in his words, women who preferred the toil of war to the blandishments of the bed. This account is extraordinary. It portrays not just individual female warriors, but an entire class of them, organized and integrated into the military structure. While they are not just followers, they are leaders, they command men, they have political power like Hetha, who ruled her own land. Skeptics point out that the Battle of Bravalla is legendary, not a historically confirmed event. That is true. But Saxo was not inventing this from nothing. He was drawing on older poems and stories that were part of the Danish oral tradition. The fact that these traditions included detailed accounts of female commanders is significant. It meant that the idea was not alien to his audience. Like the sagas, the Gesta Danorum shows us what was considered possible in the Viking imagination. The story of Webiorg, Wisna, and Hetha tells us that the concept of shield maidens was not just about lone wolf heroines like Hervor. It could also encompass women in formal military roles, leading armies into one of the greatest battles of legend. The memory of such women, real or imagined, was strong enough to be recorded by Denmark's first great historian. Number 12, the Irish Red Girl and her Viking fleet. The Viking Age was not just about what happened in Scandinavia, it was an age of expansion, and Vikings left their mark all across Europe. This means we can find clues about their society in the records of the people they encountered. The Irish Annals, a collection of records kept by monasteries in Ireland, are a rich source of information about the Viking raids and settlements there. And in these annals, we find a tantalizing glimpse of a female Viking leader. The entry appears in the Annals of Ulster and other Irish chronicles for the year 917 AD. It describes the activities of a powerful Viking leader named Ragnall Ue Imer, who was fighting to reclaim the throne of Dublin. The annals mention that his fleet was joined by another fleet, a force that came from Scotland, to fight alongside him. The leader of this second fleet is given a name, Ingen Ruaidh. In Old Irish, Ingen Ruaidh means red girl or red daughter. It was a nickname likely referring to the color of her hair. The annals are sparse on details. They simply state that she was the leader of this fleet. But that single statement is packed with meaning. She was not a passenger. She was not a wife or a concubine. She was the commander. A fleet in the 10th century was not a small thing. It represented a significant military and logistical operation. To lead a fleet, you needed to command the loyalty of hundreds of hardened warriors. You needed to be skilled in seamanship, strategy, and leadership. Ingen Ruaidh must have possessed all these qualities. We do not know her Norse name. We do not know what happened to her after the campaigns of 917. She is a fleeting figure who appears on the stage of history for a moment and then vanishes. But her presence is a powerful clue. It demonstrates that a woman could achieve a position of supreme military command among the Vikings operating in the British Isles. Her story is different from the sagas. The Irish monks who wrote the annals were not trying to tell a heroic tale. They were recording the events of their time battles, the deaths of kings, the founding of monasteries. To them, the Red Girl was just another Viking warlord, a dangerous enemy to be noted. They recorded her presence as a fact. This piece of evidence from outside the Norse world corroborates what the sagas and archaeology suggest. The world of Viking warfare and leadership was not exclusively male. A woman, known to the Irish by the color of her hair, was powerful enough to lead her own fleet into war. She was a Viking sea queen, a real-life shield maiden in command. To number 11, the woman warrior of Solor, Norway. For many years, the grave of the Birka warrior was considered unique. Even after its inhabitant was confirmed to be female, some argued it was an exception, a single woman who broke the mold. But the Birka warrior was not alone. As archaeologists apply modern scientific techniques to old discoveries, a clearer picture is emerging. One of the most important supporting cases comes from a grave found long ago in Solor, Norway. The grave was first excavated in 1900. It was a rich burial from the 10th century, the heart of the Viking Age. The skeleton was buried with a full set of weapons, a sword, a spear, a battle axe, and a shield boss. There were also arrows indicating skill in archery. Because of the weapons, the skeleton was immediately identified as a male warrior, and the remains were stored at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. For over a century, no one questioned this assumption. But recently, as part of a wider project to re-examine Viking Age burials, the bones from the Solor grave were subjected to a thorough osteological analysis. Osteology is the study of bones, and a trained specialist can determine the sex of a skeleton by looking at key features of the skull and pelvis. The results were clear. The skeleton from the warrior grave in Solor was biologically female. She had been buried with the complete arsenal of a Viking fighter. The sword was a particularly high-status weapon, the mark of a professional warrior, not a farmer. The combination of sword, spear, and axe meant she was equipped for different types of combat, from the shield wall to individual duels. The Solar Woman is a critical piece of the puzzle. She provides a direct parallel to the Birka warrior. Both were from the 10th century, both were buried with a full complement of weapons, both were initially assumed to be men, and both were later confirmed to be women through scientific analysis. This creates a pattern. It shows that Birka was not an isolated case. This find also reinforces the idea that these women were not just buried with symbolic weapons. The variety of arms in both the Birka and Solor graves suggests a life of martial activity. A warrior needed a spear for the battle line, a sword or axe for close quarters fighting, and a shield for defense. These women were buried with the complete toolkit of their trade. The woman of Solor, whose name we will never know, rests in a museum collection. But her bones tell a story. They tell of a woman who lived and was honored as a warrior in 10th century Norway. She and the Birka warrior stand as silent, skeletal proof that Shieldmaidens were not just figures of legend. They were a reality that archaeologists are only now beginning to uncover. Number 10, the Valkyries in art and myth. The Vikings did not just have stories about shield maidens, they had a profound belief in a whole class of supernatural female warriors, the Valkyries. The word Valkyrie comes from the Old Norse Valkyra, which means chooser of the slain. According to Norse mythology, these were the handmaidens of the god Odin. They would ride over battlefields on horseback, deciding who would live and who would die. They would then escort the spirits of the bravest fallen warriors to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. The Valkyries are a constant presence in Norse myth and poetry. They are described as beautiful but terrifying figures, armed with spears and helmets. They were not passive. They actively participated in the world of war, their choices shaping the outcome of human conflicts. The most famous Valkyrie, Brynhildr, is a central character in the Volsunga saga, where she is depicted as a powerful warrior in her own right before being punished by Odin. This powerful belief system is a clue in itself. A society's gods and myths reflect its values. The fact that the Norse pantheon included these formidable female figures associated with war is significant. It meant that the combination of woman and warrior was not a contradiction in their worldview, it was a divine concept. But the evidence goes beyond texts. The image of the Valkyrie appears in the physical art of the Viking Age. Archaeologists have found numerous small pendants, brooches, and amulets from the 8th to the 11th centuries that depict armed women. These figures are often shown on horseback, sometimes carrying a shield or a spear, and often holding a drinking horn to welcome a warrior to the afterlife. One striking example is a silver pendant found in Harby, Denmark. It shows a female figure in a long dress with her hair in an elaborate knot. She is holding a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. Another famous set of artifacts is the Valkyrie brooches found in places like Birka. They depict three-dimensional female figures in long gowns, but with their hair tied back as a warrior's would be, and often associated with shields. These objects were personal items worn by ordinary people. They show that the idea of the armed woman, the Valkyrie, was a part of daily life and belief. It was a protective symbol, a connection to the divine world of Odin and Valhalla. While a Valkyrie is not the same as a human shield maiden, the two concepts are deeply linked. The belief in divine female warriors created a cultural space for human ones. If Odin's own messengers were warrior women, it made the idea of a mortal woman taking up arms more plausible, even admirable. The Valkyrie was the mythological ideal, the divine archetype. The shield maiden was her human counterpart. The art and myths show that the template for the female warrior was woven into the very fabric of Norse religion and culture. Number 9. Adam of Bremen's Land of Amazons. Sometimes clues come from misunderstandings or exaggerations. In the 11th century, a German cleric named Adam of Bremen wrote a history of the Archbishopric of Hamburg. In it, He included a detailed description of the geography and peoples of Scandinavia, based on reports he heard from the Danish king Sweyn Estridsson and others. In one section, he describes a land located in the Baltic Sea, near the coast of Sweden. He calls this place the Land of Women, or the Terra Feminarum. He writes that it is inhabited by fierce, warlike women. He compares them to the Amazons of Greek mythology. He says that these women live apart from men, and that they conceive children with passing traders or with monsters. They are described as being incredibly strong and independent. If a woman gives birth to a boy, he is killed. If she gives birth to a girl, she is raised to be a warrior just like them. On the surface, this sounds like a fantastical traveler's tale. The Adam of Bremen was a churchman writing in Germany, far from the land he was describing. He was prone to mixing fact with legend. He also wrote about men with dog heads and other strange creatures in the far north. So it is easy to dismiss his Land of Amazons as pure fantasy. But it is more likely that he was reporting a garbled version of a real phenomenon. He was hearing stories about the peoples of the north, and these stories included accounts of women who were unusually independent and capable of fighting. The place he describes is often thought to be in modern-day Finland or along the northern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, areas with which the Swedish Vikings had close contact. The comparison to the Amazons is a classical trope that a learned man like Adam would use to describe any society where women held unusual power or fought in wars. It was his cultural shorthand for warrior women. So, while there probably was not a literal island inhabited only by female warriors, the story is a clue. It tells us that by the 11th century, rumors were circulating throughout Europe about the women of Scandinavia. These women had a reputation. They were seen as different, tougher, and more formidable than the women of mainland Europe. The stories were strong enough that they reached a German chronicler and were recorded as fact. Adam of Bremen's account is an echo. It is a distorted reflection of a reality he did not fully understand. The reality was likely not a whole nation of shieldmaidens, but a society where some women did fight, where women held significant authority, and where gender roles were more fluid than in his own world. His Land of Amazons is what that reality looked like from a distance, filtered through legend and the classical education of a medieval cleric. It is the smoke that points to a fire. Number 8. A warrior's daughter in 13th century Iceland. The Viking Age officially ended around the year 1066, but the culture and traditions lived on, especially in Iceland. The Sturlunga Saga is a collection of histories that chronicles the violent internal conflicts that tore Iceland apart in the 13th century. This was a time of civil war between powerful clans, and the saga is a gritty, realistic account of these struggles. It is not about mythical heroes, but about real people. And in this saga, we find a brief but compelling account of a young woman in battle. The event took place in 1255 during the Battle of Flugumiri. This was a brutal nighttime raid where one clan attacked the homestead of another. The saga gives a detailed blow-by-blow account of the fight. In the midst of the chaos, it mentions the daughter of a chieftain named Thorbergur Skolmer. The saga does not give her name, simply referring to her as Thorbergur's daughter. It says that she was wounded during the fighting. The description is simple and direct. Thorbergur Skolmer's daughter was wounded on the hand she had been fighting. This is not a romanticized description. It is a stark, factual statement embedded in a historical narrative. She was there, she was fighting, she was injured. The saga treats it as a noteworthy but not an unbelievable event. It does not stop to explain how or why a woman was fighting. It just states that she was. This is significant for several reasons. First, it takes place long after the Viking Age proper. This suggests that the tradition of women taking up arms in times of crisis did not simply vanish with the conversion to Christianity or the end of the raiding era. It was a cultural thread that continued. Second, the source is not a legendary saga about the distant past. The Sturlunga Saga was largely written by people who were contemporary to the events or who knew the participants. It is considered one of the most reliable and realistic of the Icelandic sagas. Third, The detail is mundane. She is not a great hero who turns the tide of the battle. She is just one of the defenders of the homestead, and she gets wounded. This very ordinariness makes it more believable. She was not a mythical shieldmaiden. She was a young woman defending her home and family alongside the men. The story of Thorberger's daughter provides a crucial link between the legendary shieldmaidens of the early sagas and the historical reality of later centuries. And it shows that in the desperate, violent world of clan warfare, the lines between male and female roles could blur. When your home was under attack, everyone who could hold a weapon was expected to fight, regardless of their gender. She is a late echo of the Shieldmaiden tradition, a flash of steel in a dark time. Number 7. The physical scars of battle. One of the most direct ways to find evidence of warriors is to look at their skeletons. The bones of people who live a violent life often bear the marks of that life. Healed fractures, blade cuts, and puncture wounds can tell a story of battle long after the person has died. For a long time, if a skeleton was found with such trauma, it was automatically assumed to be male. But modern forensic anthropology is challenging that assumption. A growing number of skeletons that have been identified as female through osteology or DNA analysis are showing signs of weapon-related injuries. These are not the kind of injuries you would get from a fall or a domestic accident. They are the injuries of combat. One study by scholars at the University of Tübingen examined hundreds of skeletons from a medieval cemetery in Germany. They found a female skeleton with clear evidence of a head injury inflicted by a sword. The blow was not fatal, as the bone showed signs of healing. This woman had survived a violent encounter. In Scandinavia, similar evidence is emerging. As osteologists re-examine remains from Viking Age cemeteries, they are finding women with the telltale signs of battle. These include perifractures on the forearm, a common injury that occurs when someone raises their arm to block a blow from a sword or an axe. They are also finding skulls with cut marks that match the blades of Viking swords. Researcher and archaeologist Leszek Gardella has been a pioneer in this field, systematically searching for evidence of female warriors in the archaeological record. He has compiled a catalog of female graves that contain weapons, but he also emphasizes the importance of looking at the bones themselves. He points out that even in graves without weapons, a skeleton can still tell a story of violence. A woman might have been a warrior, but been buried according to different customs, without her weapons. Her bones, however, cannot lie. This type of evidence is powerful because it is purely physical. It is not a story that could have been embellished over time. It is not an artifact that could have been placed in a grave for symbolic reasons. A healed sword cut on a woman's skull is direct proof that she was in a fight with a sword and survived. This line of inquiry is still relatively new, and it requires a systematic re-evaluation of thousands of skeletons in museum collections. But the initial findings are compelling. They suggest that an unknown number of Viking Age women lived lives that were just as violent as the men's. The scars they carried to their graves are their silent testimony, a physical clue to their role as shield maidens. Number 6. The small axe pendants of female graves. Not all weapons are for fighting. Some are for show, for status, or for religious belief. In the Viking Age, jewelry was incredibly important. It was a way to display wealth, but it also often had a deeper symbolic meaning. One of the most common types of amulet from this period is a miniature Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. But another, less discussed type of amulet also appears frequently, particularly in female graves, the miniature axe. Archaeologists have found numerous small axe head pendants made of silver, bronze, or amber in Viking burials across Scandinavia and beyond. What is striking is their context. While full-sized axes are found in both male and female graves, these miniature symbolic axes seem to be disproportionately associated with women. What did they signify? There are several theories. One is that they are connected to the Valkyries. In some depictions, Valkyries are shown with axes, and the axe was a weapon associated with both war and divine power. Wearing an axe pendant might have been a way for a woman to invoke the protection and power of these supernatural warrior figures. Another theory connects them to female authority. The axe was not just a weapon, it was also a tool and a symbol of power within the household. The mistress of a large farmstead, the Husfreyja, held the keys to the food stores and chests. She was a figure of considerable domestic power. A symbolic axe could have represented this authority, the power to hew a path for her family and manage a large estate. But, we cannot discount the most direct interpretation that it was a symbol of a woman's connection to the world of warriors. It could have been an emblem of her status as a shield maiden or a sign of her family's warrior lineage. For a woman living in a martial society, an axe pendant could be a way of expressing her own identity within that world, even if she did not fight in every battle. A particularly interesting find comes from a grave in Tuna, Sweden. An entire cemetery seems to have been dedicated to high-status women, many of whom were buried with these symbolic axes. This suggests a community or a lineage where this symbol was particularly important for female identity. These small axes are a subtle but important clue. They show that the association between women and a primary weapon of war was not considered strange or taboo. It was common enough to be turned into jewelry. It was a concept that women wore around their necks. Whether it represented a spiritual connection, domestic authority, or a personal warrior identity, the axe pendant demonstrates that the world of weapons and the world of women were not separate. They were intertwined in the symbolism and personal expression of the Viking Age. Number 5, Lagertha, the warrior who impressed a king. In his Gesta Danorum, Saxo Grammaticus tells the story of the legendary hero Ragnar Lothbrok. Early in his career, Ragnar went to Norway to avenge the death of his grandfather. When he arrived, he found that the local women who had been oppressed by the enemy were eager for revenge. They dressed in men's clothing and joined his army. Saxo writes that leading these women was a skilled warrior named Lagertha. He was astounded by her. He says she had the courage of a man in a woman's body. He describes her fighting in the front rank of the battle, her hair flying loose over her shoulders. Her skill and bravery were so remarkable that everyone knew she was the key to the victory. Ragnar was so impressed by Lagertha's performance in battle that he fell in love with her. He sought her out after the fight and asked to marry her. Lagertha, being as clever as she was brave, set a test for him. She had a bear and a great hound guard her home. Ragnar had to kill both beasts before he could win her hand. He succeeded, and they were married. They had children together, but their marriage did not last. Ragnar later divorced her to marry a Swedish princess, but his connection to Lagertha was not over. When Ragnar later faced a civil war and was in desperate need of support, he sent for Lagertha. She was still in love with him. She gathered a fleet of 120 ships and sailed to his aid, once again turning the tide of a battle and saving his life. The story ends with Lagertha returning to Norway, where she quarrels with her new husband, kills him with a concealed spearhead, and usurps his title and rule. Lagertha's story is almost certainly a legend. Historians have not been able to find independent evidence for her existence. But like the other legendary tales, it is a crucial clue to the Viking mindset. Lagertha is presented as a complete character. She is not just a fighter, she is a commander, a strategist, and a political ruler. Saxo's source for the tale was likely an older Norse oral tradition. The fact that this story of a woman who was a better fighter than most men was preserved and passed down for generations is significant. It shows what qualities the Vikings admired. They admired courage, skill, and leadership, and they were perfectly comfortable attributing these qualities to a woman. Lagertha is not a passive character in a man's story. She is an agent of her own destiny. She fights because she wants to. She leads because she is capable. She even commits murder to seize power for herself. She is a complex and formidable figure. The popularity of her story suggests that the Viking Age was a time and place where such a woman was not only imaginable, but celebrated. She is the archetypal shield maiden, a legend built on a foundation of cultural possibility. Number 4. The social power and freedom of Viking women. The existence of shieldmaidens would be almost impossible to believe if Viking Age women were kept in a state of subjugation, with no rights or power. But that was not the case at all. Compared to women in many other parts of medieval Europe, Norse women enjoyed a remarkable degree of freedom and authority. This social reality is the foundation upon which the idea of the female warrior could be built. Viking Age law codes, such as the Icelandic Gragas, give us a clear picture of this. Women could own property. They could inherit land and wealth, not just from their fathers, but also from their husbands and sons. A woman's property remained her own even after marriage. This was a crucial source of independence. A woman with her own land and wealth had a voice and a measure of control over her own life. Marriage was a contract between two families, not a sale of the bride. A woman had the right to consent to a marriage, and just as importantly, she had the right to divorce her husband. The grounds for divorce were clearly laid out. A man could be divorced if he was abusive, if he impoverished the family, or even if he wore clothing that was considered too feminine. If a couple divorced, the woman took back her dowry and any property she had brought into the marriage. Within the household, the woman was the master. The mistress of the farm, or husfreyja, held the keys to the chests in the food stores. This was a position of immense responsibility and power. She managed the farm's resources, oversaw the servants and children, and was in charge of producing textiles, a vital part of the Viking economy. When the men were away on trading voyages or raids, which could be for months or even years at a time, the women were left in complete control of the farm and its defense. This environment fostered women who were competent, self-reliant, and used to being in charge. They had to be tough and pragmatic to survive. In a world where a raid could happen at any time, it is logical to assume that a woman left in charge of a farm would know how to defend it. The skills of management and defense were closely linked. This social standing is a critical clue. Shieldmaidens did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from a society that granted women legal rights, economic power, and significant social authority. A woman who could own land, command a household, and divorce her husband was not a passive object. She was an active participant in her society. From this position of strength, it is not a huge leap to imagine some of these formidable women also taking up arms, either to defend their homes or to seek their own fortunes in the wider world. The Viking woman was no damsel in distress. She was a power to be reckoned with, and that is the perfect starting point for a warrior. Number 3, the grave of a young woman with an arrow in her head. In 1986, a team of archaeologists was excavating a large Viking burial ground on the island of Langland in Denmark. They found one grave that stood out. It belonged to a young woman, likely between 15 and 20 years old. She was buried in a simple manner without any high-status grave goods, but the way she died was anything but simple. Embedded in her pelvic bone was the head of a Viking arrow, and in her skull, just above her right eye, was another arrowhead. The arrows were not placed there as part of a ritual. The positioning and the damage to the bones showed that they were the cause of death. This young woman had been shot in the face and in the lower body. These were battle injuries. She had died a violent death, struck down by an archer. This discovery is a chilling and powerful clue. It is not about a woman buried with weapons as a sign of status. It is about a woman who was a victim of warfare or perhaps a participant. Was she a warrior killed in a fight? Or was she a civilian caught in the crossfire of a raid? We cannot know for sure, but the evidence places her squarely in the middle of a violent conflict. Some might argue this proves nothing about Shieldmaidens. She could have been a non-combatant killed when her village was attacked. That is possible, but the location of the wounds is suggestive. Being shot in the face implies she was facing her attacker. This was not an arrow fired randomly into a fleeing crowd. Let's consider the context. Viking raids were a reality of life. When a settlement was attacked, everyone would have been involved in the defense. A young, able-bodied woman would not have stood by passively. She would have fought to defend her home and her family. In that desperate struggle, she would have been as much a target as any man. This grave is a stark reminder of the brutality of the Viking Age. It strips away the romance of the sagas and shows us the reality of violence. This young woman's skeleton is hard, physical evidence of women's presence on the battlefield. Whether she identified as a shieldmaiden or was simply a defender of her home, she faced the same dangers as a male warrior, and she died from the same weapons. Her anonymous grave is, in its own way, as important as the grand burial of the Birka warrior. It shows that violence was not just something that happened to men. Women were on the receiving end of it, and it is highly likely they were on the giving end as well. She is a silent witness to the fact that when the swords were drawn and the arrows flew, women were there in the thick of it. Number 2, the girl who fought on a Norwegian ship. The evidence for shield maidens does not stop in the Viking Age. The traditions and stories carried on, and sometimes they pop up in the most unexpected places. One of the most intriguing accounts comes from a much later source, the History of Norway, a short chronicle written by a monk in the 12th century. The author is anonymous, but he provides a summary of Norwegian history and geography. When describing the remote northern regions of Norway, he mentions the people who live there, the Sami, and other northern folk. In this section, he relays a strange story he has heard about a specific event. He writes about a time when raiders from the north came down to attack the settled lands of Norway. The Norwegians sent out ships to intercept them. A battle was fought at sea. The Norwegians were victorious, and after the battle, they captured one of the enemy ships. When they boarded the captured vessel, they were astonished by what they found. The crew was made up of both men and women. The monk writes that the women were fighting just as fiercely as the men. Among them, they found one young woman who was particularly striking. The account says she was beautiful, but she was fighting with great skill and courage. She was the commander of the ship. During the battle, this young woman had been wounded. One of the Norwegian warriors had managed to cut off her hand with a sword blow. Despite this grievous injury, she did not surrender. She continued to fight and command her crew until she was finally captured. This story is brief and told secondhand by a monk writing decades after the event, but it has the ring of a genuine report. It is specific and contains details like the severed hand that make it feel real. The monk is not telling a heroic saga. He is reporting what he has heard about the strange customs of the people from the far north. Like the account of John Skylitzy's, this is an outsider's perspective. A Norwegian monk is describing the behavior of a different cultural group. To him, the idea of women fighting on a warship was strange and noteworthy. This suggests it was not a common practice among the Norwegians of his own time and place, but it was a known practice among others in the wider Scandinavian world. The story of the girl with the severed hand shows us that the phenomenon of the shield maiden might have been more common in certain regions or among certain groups. It was not necessarily a universal practice, but it existed in pockets. This account, preserved in a dusty Latin chronicle, is a fragment of her story, a testament to a young woman who was not just a warrior, but a captain of her own ship who fought to the bitter end. Number 1, a warrior's grave for a warrior woman. We return to where we started, grave BJ 581 at Birka. The sheer weight of the evidence from this single burial is the most powerful clue we have. The 2017 DNA analysis was just the final definitive confirmation. Everything else about the grave had been pointing to the same conclusion for years, if only people had been willing to see it. Let's look again at what was buried with her. A sword, an axe, a spear, a battle knife. These are the offensive weapons. 2 shields. These are the defensive weapons. A full set of 25 armor-piercing arrows capable of punching through the chainmail of the time. This was a specialist, an archer, likely on horseback, and she had the horses to prove it, a mare and a stallion, buried with her, ready to ride into the afterlife. This was not just a warrior, this was an officer, a professional soldier. The location of her grave is also critical. Birka was a major military and trading hub. Her grave was situated on a high terrace right outside the main gate of the town's fortress. It was a position of honor overlooking the garrison. This was not a quiet corner of the cemetery. It was prime real estate, a place reserved for someone who was integral to the defense of the town. And then there are the gaming pieces. On her lap was a full set for a game called Nafadafal, a Viking strategy game similar to chess. The pieces were made of bone, and the board would have been made of wood, which has long since rotted away. The presence of this game is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. It was not just a game for passing the time, and it was widely seen as a tool for training the mind in military strategy and tactics. Kings and chieftains in the sagas are often depicted playing Nefatafal, pondering their next move in the game as they ponder their next move on the battlefield. Her burial did not just say, this was a fighter. It said, this was a leader, a strategist, someone who commanded others in battle. The combination of the full weapon set, the 2 horses, the strategic grave location, and the gaming pieces paints a picture of a high-ranking military commander. For over a century, the assumption that this person had to be male was so strong that it blinded researchers to the evidence of the bones themselves. The confirmation that she was a woman changed everything. It proved that a woman in the Viking Age could not only be a warrior, but she could also achieve a high rank and be buried with all the honors of her position. She was not buried as a wife, a mother, or a priestess who happened to have some weapons with her. She was buried as a warrior. Her identity, as presented in her grave for eternity, was that of a military professional. The Birka warrior woman is the anchor for all the other clues. The sagas, the chronicles, the laws, the other graves, they all make more sense in the light of her existence. She is the proof, written in bone and iron and stone, that the Shieldmaiden was real.